I have to tell you, my chest is positively vibrating after that last song, and my eyes are damp. So it's nonetheless time to begin with Newe Tsine Masi, by giving thanks to the Creator for the gift of our lives and the gift of this day and the grace that has brought us all safely to it. I appreciate the acknowledgement of the traditional territory that was given so well by Reverend Sinclair, and I want to further acknowledge that this is sacred space where we are gathered today, and I so appreciate the beauty of this space and the extraordinary beauty of the musical gifts we've been receiving all evening from all of our gifted musicians. Thank you so much for that. And of course, I want to thank the Toronto United Church Council for honoring me with this Heart and Vision Award, and it is so very meaningful to receive it in your good company, Roberta. You know, we've known each other and overlapped, certainly over the course of the work of the Commission, but even before that, for complementary efforts, shall I say, to trying to draw attention to the many faces and ages where social justice deserves both investment and recognition. And I want to say a particular word of appreciation to the United Church Council, because especially of the initiatives you undertake in this city and beyond on housing projects and other initiatives of great need. And I really very much appreciate the announcement that was made tonight about projects and initiatives in the continuing spirit of reconciliation. And may I just say, because I so rarely over the past 6.5 years have got to say this, it's been a bit of a long and lonely ride, that I'm very happy to be here tonight in the good company of a number of special friends and loved ones, but including the Honorable Stephen Capri. As my husband and a residential school survivor himself, he has been essential to me, both as a long-distance daily lifeline and also a daily reminder of our TRC purpose, as I've spent so much of the past many years away from home, and feeling that tie to home through him has been life-sustaining and made my work possible. But tonight, you may not realize it, but I'm in my other home. We live in the Northwest Territories, but in fact, I'm originally from southwestern Ontario. So this actually feels pretty close to the neighborhoods of my childhood, teenage, and university years. Being so close to my birthplace, and with yesterday's celebration of Mother's Day, I'm also feeling very close to my own mother, who passed away in the very midst of our truth and reconciliation journey. It was a very difficult time. And I experience, there's no question, Mother's Day differently now. In gratitude for the gift of the children who now honor me, but also in loving memory of my own mother, and very acutely in honor of the mothers who were left behind for so many decades when their children were taken from them. In the case of my own mother, I've had to learn how to transform that relationship, how to resurrect it, if you will, how to keep her and the stories of her life alive for the teachings they continue to offer me, and for my grandchildren to know her and to love her. The lonely and heart-wrenching demands of the TRC, in fact, helped me find ways to do that, because my mother would show up in the rooms where we were gathered, where residential school survivors were talking about their own mothers, about their aches and regrets in being separated from them for such faraway school days when they were such little children. And there suddenly my mom would be, her spirit right there beside me, reminding me of all that was in my life and all that should have been there for those little children also. But most of all, in her new way of being present, reminding me that transformation is indeed possible. Just as I can now experience her in a new way, so too I firmly believe, and Roberta touched upon this as well, I believe that we are beginning to experience our country in a new way. The beautiful name of tonight's award, Heart and Vision, it sits there as both a provocation and a promise in the aftermath of an historical vision of Canada that seemed, in fact, to hold so little heart. It seemed in so many ways a self-serving vision, to the benefit of so many at the expense of so many others, and to, in fact, be heartless in many ways as well. For surely visionary notions of a good and caring society, friendly relations with founding partners, and consideration for the basic needs of the weakest among us, our children, surely such visionary notions do not sound like this. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. Those words by our very first Prime Minister, the benighted Sir John A. Macdonald, were spoken back in the 1870s, but the last residential schools in Canada, as many of you in this room know, did not close until 1996. Somehow, most of us in the adult population of Canada, I suspect most of us in this room, managed to grow up not knowing a single thing about those schools and not knowing much more about Indigenous peoples in general. Ignorance is a very peaceful state of mind, isn't it? It can keep us from thinking about things that might make us uncomfortable. It can keep us confident in the beliefs that some of us were taught in school and that we've heard some of our national leaders repeat. Beliefs that Canada, being a country not involved in colonizing others. It can keep us comfortable in our international image of ourselves as a peacekeeping nation out there in the world, without having to pay much attention to how peaceful things really are or aren't right here in our midst. For the past 6.5 years, my commissioner colleagues and I, Justice Murray Sinclair, now Senator Sinclair, Chief Dr. Wilton Littlechild, and myself, we three have been doing everything we can to break Canada out of its peaceful state of ignorance about an issue that is now finally beginning to capture our national attention. We all owe this opportunity to the heroes of the residential school story, who are not our governments, who are not the commissioners, but who are the 80,000 residential school survivors who took on the federal government and the churches in the courts and won the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history. That is why we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Not because any government created it, but because the children who were the victims of state-sponsored harms for over 130 years in our country fought for it, so that their voices and their experiences finally could be heard, and so that Canada could finally crawl out of its own bed of secrets and begin to greet a new day. We heard those voices, of course, over the course of 6.5 years, and I know that many of you in this room were in those rooms with me. Through almost 7,000 recorded statements, we heard those voices in hundreds of community events in every region of the country, in 7 major national events that lasted 4 days each, and in closing events that brought together residential school survivors and church leadership, rock and rollers and parade marshals, prime ministers and school children, and for a brief and beautiful moment, the hearts and minds of the country. How do you capture such a moment? How do you keep it from slipping away? That is exactly the challenge now before us all. My father was a man of many expressions, and a few of you in this room I know got to meet him over the years, in past years. A man of many expressions, and I admit that more than a few of them were profane. But he used to use a particular phrase in the face of a great challenge. He would say, "Marie, this will take more than a wish and a prayer." Reconciliation, healing, respectful relationships, and peace. This journey will take much more than a wish and a prayer. It will take vision and heart, not an evening celebration, but committed and sustained action. Not a moment, but a movement. Above all else, as I've said countless times before, we must realize that the story of residential schools and all the colonial thinking that led to the creation of them and the passing of laws that are still on our books today, that all of this is Canadian history, not Indigenous history, and the way forward equally belongs to all of us. That way forward is the course that the TRC has charted based on all that we've seen, heard, and learned. We've concluded with 94 calls to action that address specific areas of work for every level of government and every sector of society to undertake: the academy, the municipalities, the provinces and territories, the Indigenous leadership, student leaders, the corporate sector, the media, the arts, the world of sports, all of us. And if you have not yet read these calls to action, this is the bare minimum promise you need to make to yourself in leaving here tonight, to read them, all 94. And I always stress it's not 94 pages. It's only about a dozen. 94 calls to action. And in reading them, ask yourself, as you read, where does my name belong? Where do I need to sign up, whether to take action myself or to champion and influence the action of others? Underlying each and every one of those calls to action is what you might also call the heart of the TRC's vision for a renewed Canada. We refer to them as the principles of reconciliation. And let me quickly go through them, because much has been made of the calls to action, but I believe the underlying principles, as the ribbon running through them all, are very important to note as well. The first is that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples needs to be seen as an active framework for reconciliation, and so to be referenced regularly and frequently as an increasingly familiar document. Second, we need to acknowledge that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples have treaty constitutional rights that must be recognized and respected. These are not old, dusty contracts about Indigenous people. They are living, breathing, moral covenants between peoples, including ourselves. Thirdly, reconciliation is a process of healing relationships. And in many examples, it's actually a process of making and creating relationships where none have existed. We have far too many parts of our country still where we never find ourselves in the same rooms. Reconciliation requires action to address the destructive impacts, and Roberta touched on a number of these regarding education and language, culture, child welfare, justice, and so on. We actually have world-class examples of how to do this, not just equalizing the level playing field, as we sometimes say, but bringing in extraordinary remedial reparation packages, as we did post-war in Europe with the Marshall Plan, because we knew that it would take so much investment just to get to a fair starting point. Reconciliation must create a more equitable society and closing the gaps. It isn't just about being nice guys to each other. It is about being fair and sharing in the ways that we were welcomed originally to this continent. And so all Canadians are treaty peoples, and we all share that responsibility. Just as in a marriage, we are both married, not just the one side. We all are treaty peoples, and we need to learn what that means, and we need to start acting as if it matters to us. We need to value and pay attention to the Aboriginal elders and their knowledge that they keep for us and have kept, and especially what they can tell us about the concepts of reconciliation and peace building. Aboriginal cultural revitalization and those knowledge systems are essential to the reconciliation process, and I can tell you that as we did our work, the presence and accessibility of that in our midst was essential to the peaceful unfolding of our work and our ability to stay strong in the midst of it. Reconciliation requires political will, joint leadership, trust building, accountability, transparency, and an investment of resources. Yes, this will cost. But you know, we spent billions of dollars over decades and more than a century trying to destroy things. Surely we can come up with the money that is needed to try to reclaim and support reclamation and repair and retribution. And the 10th is that reconciliation requires sustained public education. And I'm especially happy to welcome anyone here, any of our young people, and anyone who is new to this story, who is still just beginning to learn about it, because we need to keep talking about it. I promised survivors I would never stop telling their story, the story of their heroism and the story of their strength and resilience, because we know that we have barely begun to scratch the surface of understanding what happened. The heart of this vision calls upon each and every one of us to understand that we are all called to be part of the new way forward, even as we own up to our central part in the damages of the past. I was raised in the Christian tradition of the United Church, and although we are now in the Easter season of that faith, we are called upon to ask ourselves an age-old question from the Christmas season: what gift can I bring? In an address to journalism students at Ryerson University earlier this year, I noted that my professional gift of journalism has taken me to every region of this country and to many countries beyond, and has introduced me to countless circumstantial experts, as I call them, whether in positions of power or of poverty. I've experienced what I call the great exchange of journalism, the learning from some that equips you for the teaching of so many others. That is the lifeblood of the journalist as I regarded it. You receive, and then you give. You are taught, and then you teach. As the conveyor of that information, it is a privileged position of trust. And in some ways, I think my work as a TRC commissioner has been my greatest act of journalism ever. I've spent 6.5 years learning directly from residential school survivors about their childhood experiences and those of 150,000 others. I sat through hours, days, and months of statements to grasp the complexity of the story and to grow in my understanding of the parts of it that make it a uniquely Canadian story. I've had to work with fellow commissioners to agree on the essentials at the heart of that story. And I've had to work tirelessly to capture and hold the attention of the always distracted and the often disinterested, to hold that attention to the importance of this story in the face of so many other competing ones. In so many ways, at the heart of the residential school story is impoverishment and poverty itself. The displacement and dispossession of what was held and what was owned, whether land or language or culture or children, and the leaving behind a deprivation and a poverty, both financial and spiritual, that was so compromised. With our laws and our policies, We've impoverished Indigenous people in every region of our country and in every major city. We see it all around us if we dare to look. And we have impoverished ourselves so tremendously as a country, depriving ourselves of the human potential of so many individuals in our midst, and depriving our country of the richest diversity and wealth of cultures, languages, and deep traditional knowledge about governance models, where we struggle with the ones we now have, and about our lands and environment at a time when our world is in fact starving for new answers. Do we have the humility to begin looking at some of the oldest knowledge to find the newest answers? I think we got some fundamental things right in our TRC approach to the residential school story, and a few of these may also serve you well as you contemplate how you will now contribute your own gifts towards the vision of respectful relationships. The first is build trust, create safe space. We can never build relationships if we never find ourselves in the same rooms together. As we've seen tonight and as we've done, respect the protocols of where we are. Acknowledge the place and its elders. Introduce ourselves by relationship, because you know, wherever we are in Canada, wherever we are on someone's Indigenous homeland. We need to listen to each other patiently and to listen with good heart. Trying to figure out everything in our heads has not served us well as a country. We need to recognize the importance of the work we are engaged in and the enormity of it. The enormity of it. Some communities in this country where 90% of the adult population went to residential school, and now please will you go home and just be good parents. We need to recognize that enormity and we need to fight for it. We need to fight for the calls to action, not only what we can do, but what we need to hold others to doing. We need to find and cultivate our allies, and I know there are allies in this room, in this sacred place. We must not assume a lack of public interest. One of the most heartening things for me was to see the progression from our first national event, where about 10% of the tens of thousands of people who showed up were non-Indigenous, and by the 7th national event, 3 years later, where 60% of the tens of thousands who showed up were non-Indigenous people. We can't let that slide. We need to keep building that momentum. There is a reason why among our TRC honorary witnesses, there were Holocaust survivors and Rwandan genocide survivors and Chinese Canadian survivors, because they understood the point of solidarity in survivorship, and they recognized the potential to stand together. Engage youth. We need not talk about youth. We need to create space so that youth can speak for themselves. Stay vigilant. We cannot afford to get tired of this issue. We cannot get tired of the story, and we cannot give up. And may I say that we also, in any case, don't want to miss the sequel. We should not assume it's over. We should not assume it's without heroes. And we should also not assume that we cannot become some of those heroes. We need to hold all our governments to account. Last December, and many of you will have heard this, our new Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, said, "No relationship is more important to me and to Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples." It's time for a renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. We must remind him, but also support him in his commitment to deliver on his pledge to implement all 94 of those calls to action. And we must remind faith communities of their promises. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued specific calls to action for churches who ran the residential schools. including the duty to comply with the UN Declaration, the responsibility to educate congregations about the Church's role in colonization and residential schools, a responsibility to train church leaders to respect Indigenous spirituality in its own right, to fund community-controlled healing, language revitalization, and relationship-building projects, the faith communities, to help fund that, to participate in the commemoration of children who died at the schools, the more than 3,000 that we know for sure, the 6,000 that we expect, and the perhaps thousands more than that, who will eventually be identified when the atrociously kept government records are finally pieced together and we can put a first name and a last name and an age and a gender together in a way that may add up to a whole child. We need also to support, through the faith communities, the efforts to make the residential school legacy, treaties, past and present Indigenous contributions to this country, mandatory learning within the school curriculum for all our children, so that we are no longer investing in the ignorance of our adult population. Last June, we heard a collective response from the churches who ran Canada's residential schools. And it said, "We welcome the Commissioner's call to the parties to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement for a new covenant of reconciliation that would renew and expand our shared commitment to the continuing work of reconciliation. And we invite others into that work, including new Canadians, who, while they were not part of the historic injustice, are now part of a country in which understanding and addressing that injustice is a national priority for all Canadians. Above all, we welcome the Commissioner's calls as providing the basis for a wide and transformative conversation among Canadians about the better future we intend to foster, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for all of us who long to live in a society grounded in right relationships and equity. And then the response goes on to make a commitment to continue to share in the work of healing and reconciliation, respectfully following the Indigenous leadership, their communities and leaders, and to offer leadership among non-Indigenous Canadians where that's appropriate. It's an invitation to not give up in our efforts to do the right thing, while also working hard to reframe the right realities around us and within us. In that same spirit, I recall the words of some of the residential school survivors who spoke to the TRC, words of extraordinary inspiration, resilience, courage, and encouragement to us all. We need to find ethical space. We need to create ethical space where the wisdom of the Western peoples and the wisdom of the Indigenous peoples can both be heard, can both be valued, can be shared in ways that will enrich us all. I turned "you can't do it, you'll never amount to anything," to "I can do it. I didn't give up." Live the best you can. It's people like us that have got to start planting the seeds. You know, we're heading into the 150th anniversary of this country, and it's surely one of the biggest unfolding stories we can anticipate over the next year and a half. We must not allow ourselves to get trapped in the self-congratulatory hoopla of our own historical spin. Rather, we must honor the importance of truthful historical context in framing what we can indeed worthily celebrate. But let us also consider what worthy and urgent birthday wishes we need to ask for ourselves as a country as we grow into the years ahead. For we are not yet the biggest country we can still become. We are a northern country. We are a country of snow, and that's more true where Stephen and I live, perhaps, than here. But we are an indigenous country of great storytellers. So on this beautiful springtime evening, forgive me as I end with a winter story, but it is a story about birds. And I'll invite you to hear it as our story. It's a story of a chickadee and a dove. And one day the chickadee asked, "How much does a snowflake weigh?" "Why, less than nothing, nothing at all, really," said the dove. And the chickadee said, "Once I was sitting on the branch of a fir tree, and it started to snow. Not a violent storm, but a beautiful, soft, steady snowfall. Because I had nothing better to do, I started counting the snowflakes that were falling onto the branch where I was sitting, the very branch where I was sitting. I counted 3,751,952. Then the next snowflake fell, weighing less than nothing, as you say. And suddenly, the branch snapped and fell. After telling the story, the little chickadee flew away. And now the dove, as many of us know, is recognized as somewhat of an expert in the field of peace, and we even call it a peace dove. So the dove thought about the story and then eventually said to itself, "Maybe all that's still missing is one more person, so that everything can start to shift and the world can begin to live in peace with all our relations." Lagotene. So as I'm invited here tonight in the spirit of a Vision and Heart Award and to receive this wonderful award, which I share so thankfully with all the residential school survivors and the intergenerational survivors in this room and in this country, may I invite us all, as indeed the TRC calls to action invite us all to do, to contemplate whether our own tiny contribution can become the one that tips the balance of complacency, that disrupts the comfort of disregard, and that begins to blanket our country with a new and loving regard of respect and peace between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of Canada. As the Dene and Inuit people say, where my family lives, Masicho and Kwainami. As my Anishinaabe and Cree TRC brothers say, Miigwech and Hai Hai. Nyawan, Roberta. As I learned in school, merci beaucoup. And as I learned in my own childhood home, where my own parents got to raise and teach me, thank you very much.